So, surprise, surprise, the president of Smartmatic has just been indicted on corruption charges, and that guy's name is Roger Pignate. And of course, those who've been following the story, Smartmatic was the company that pushed back really hard back in 2020 on anyone who would deign to say anything dodgy had happened during that election. And it's not just the president, it's also the former president's brother-in-law who was also indicted. So obviously big news, not that the media is covering it. They're just happy that Fox News had to pay nearly $1 billion to another company called Dominion. And so they're just not going to touch this. But, wow, what a story.
Yeah, I mean, Dominion's a lot more prominent in the US, but Smartmatic was very vocally large. And, the US market's kind of dominated by Smartmatic or Dominion rather, and then Smartmatic to a lesser degree. I had to laugh at the press release that got issued last night because when I first saw this news, and it was Michael Waller was the guy who brought it to my attention and sent out a tweet that all I said was, holy crap. Because this just unearths, I think we're going to, find a lot more information. But regardless, Smartmatic was forced to respond late yesterday, and they sent something out. Smartmatic has learned that 2 of our employees have been indicted for alleged violations, blah, 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 almost 10 years ago. What they don't tell you is that one of the 2 employees is their president and current chief operating officer. I've seen some people say CEO. That's actually not technically correct. He's president and COO. And this is the Roger Pignata. I think it's Pignata Alvarez. He's got like 4 names, which, it's not that unusual. But he resides in Boca Raton, by the way, which is sort of the heart of... Put it this way. From my financial background, if somebody was in Boca Raton as a CEO of a company, I was immediately wary. But, the fact that they failed to mention that he's their president and chief operating officer, and if you go into their bio for him, he's literally listed as handling all day-to-day operations for the company. So it's just incredible how they tried to play this off. But obviously this got the attention of everybody after, what we went through in 2020 and all the discussion of the use of voting machines. Something that I've been writing about for a long time. There's a lot of issues with the voting machines in general.
There is. There's also another guy, Eli Moreno, who is, we haven't independently checked this, but Michael Waller says that he's the brother-in-law of the immediate past president. So those are the 2 guys they're talking about here. And
just some employees.
Well, those are they were on the cleaning crew. So the story is not about the U.S., so just to make that clear, it's about the Philippines. And so apparently Smartmatic sold the Philippines a bunch of their machines and their equipment, and they basically overpriced it, and then a portion of that money went back to some Philippine official. That's essentially what the story is here.
I think a fairly large amount.
Right. That's right. But which kind of immediately makes you think, well, if they're doing such corrupt, dodgy things anywhere, what would stop them from doing them in the U.S.? And what people have said, Smartmatic obviously said, oh, these are just 2 employees, hardly knew them. But what other people have been saying, well, this doesn't really concern us. This is just some, corruption in the Philippines, right? Well, it does, because if you have a company that does corrupt dealings in one place, you have to assume they do corrupt dealings in every place, right? If it's worth to them going to jail for however many millions it was in terms of selling the machines to the Philippines, well, what does it tell you about other things that they might get up to? And I've always thought it was a very dodgy company, just the way they portrayed themselves online. And some of these tweets are now going to come back and bite them. So right after the 2020 election, they put out a tweet saying that everything that's said about fraud or problems with the election, that's all misinformation. And by the way, they claim that misinformation is sort of the biggest problem in all of democracy, in all of elections. Why would they say that? They make machines for allegedly voting. Well, what are they? Who are they to tell us about misinformation and how all that works? So I thought that was very strange. But what they said on top of that is that that they never had any connections, contacts with any election officials anywhere in the world. Well, we know now that's not true, because they had a lot of connections with those Philippine ones that they got bribed, or that they bribed, so allegedly bribed. So it boggles the mind that a company that has so much leverage. I mean, running a voting machine is sort of the core of everything. You're sitting there with all this power, that a company that does this is so completely corrupt. It's just mind-blowing.
Yeah, to put things, you're talking about the position, the statements that Smartmatic was making after the election. Well, what that dovetails into really is the entire election system. And let me kind of explain that. Everybody can probably remember, I think it was on November 12th. I'm looking at something I wrote way back in 2020 on this. CISA put out a statement saying that the November 3rd election was the most secure in American history. And I think everybody remembers that statement. It was issued by CISA. Well, sort of. The statement was put out by CISA, but the statement was actually issued by two councils which work underneath CISA. And it was the CISA's Election Infrastructure Sector Coordinating Council. Real fancy name. Well, that sounds great, but then you start looking at who's actually part of that council, and it's every election company, manufacturer, and software-related entity. So there's not that many people. There was maybe 15 to 20 of them, but two of the prominent ones that were on that council that wrote the statement that CISA issued was Smartmatic and Dominion Voting, along with ProVNV, which was a tester of machines for both companies, primarily Dominion. So that statement that the election was the most secure in history was actually being put out by the manufacturers and the people who run the voting systems that were being questioned. So, that's kind of the backdrop. And what we discovered very quickly is there is a very close series of ties between CISA, EAC, the election something commission, I'll find it in a minute here, and these other companies. And as I began to explore this back then, what I just was really shocked to find was how small these government entities were. They were staffed by 15 to 20 people, and it was really the tail wagging the dog that the underlying manufacturers were much larger. So that's kind of how Smartmatic comes into this and puts those statements into context.
That's right. And again, coming back to their own tweets, right? So they were very strong on this misinformation thing. By the way, have you noticed how every one of these frauds, like the proximal origin frauds and the COVID origin saga, they're big on that too. They push out, misinformation. The Russiagate frauds, they're big on that too. They push out misinformation. So it's like all the frauds, but that's their word that they seize on, they jump on, and then they put it out and say misinformation is bad. Well, leaving aside that whole discussion, I mean, just focus on what you're supposed to do. What the hell are they doing talking about misinformation? They're supposed to be selling these machines. That's literally their job. And the other thing that I always found sort of very odd is that they're also in the business of selling and organizing these drop boxes, which is, of course, a zero technology thing. So you combine these highly advanced machines, supposedly, with drop boxes. So they're kind of doing it all. Well, what's a private company doing that? I'm coming back to my main point here, which is elections are sacrosanct. That's the essence of everything. You can go back to ancient Greece, where all this started off from. The reason there's democracy, the way that democracy is organized, is sort of the numbers game is simply to prevent wars. That was the initial idea. If there's 51 of you and 49 of us, then you're probably going to win if we have a war. So let's not have a war, but instead you guys get to be in charge for a while, and then in a few years' time we'll do it again. Well, that's a very beautiful concept, but you have to have trust, and hence this idea of the ancient Greeks scribbled on a piece of rock. You write the name or put a tick on a piece of paper. That's just the way it's supposed to be. And frankly, even if in 1,000 years from now and people live on Mars or whatever, it should still be that way. Mm-hmm. And the reason is because you need the trust, and that's the only way you can have the ultimate trust. Now, What we have now is having people enter something into a machine, and then we're supposed to trust the fact that that machine is going to reflect what actually happened. Now, in order to have that trust, we got to, I mean, first of all, I don't think it's possible. You simply can't do that. I'm not an IT guy. I don't know what's possible. I know there's a lot of stuff possible that can happen on my iPhone, on my computer, that I don't know anything about. I will never know about, because I'm not into the weeds of that stuff. Why would I trust a machine or the guy who programmed the machine with my vote? But even if we were to assume that's a good idea because you can tally up the votes quickly and, whatever, what on earth are we doing giving that task to a company that was demonstrably shady to begin with, and now you've got these indictments as well? And we're talking about it. People in our corner on Twitter are talking about it, but I haven't seen anything in the media about it. In the Philippines media, they're talking about it, not in the U.S.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've seen our media doesn't want to talk about this, right? Because our media is aligned with the DNC, which wants to use voting machines. So they're going to try to avoid this story, I would assume, as much as they possibly can. If you just go back in theory, like I remember hearing about, before I knew anything, and probably before I even started looking at Russiagate, was hearing about some of these election systems coming forth. Like, just when somebody tells you and you're not thinking about it, it kind of sounds like a good idea. Oh, we're going to have a new system where you just go in and you just touch, on a touch screen, and you put who it is, and then it's instantly, everybody can see the results. Like, that kind of sounds okay at first blush. But of course, as we know, computers don't work like that. Things aren't that secure. There's always a backdoor, et cetera, et cetera. And despite all that, we had these companies claiming that everything was extraordinarily safe. And when I first started looking, I'm just going to read a couple of things here. This is a guy named Harry Hursty, who I first stumbled across. He's an expert in this stuff and has been used in the Georgia cases extensively. And the reason he first got involved is he was an observer in the June 9th statewide Georgia primaries way back on like 2020. So it was June of 2020. And he was watching what was happening, and he summarized his findings as follows. 1, the scanner and tabulation software settings being employed to determine which votes to count on hand-marked paper ballots are likely causing clearly intentioned votes not to be counted. 2, the voting system is being operated in Fulton County in a manner that escalates the security risk to an extreme level. 3, voters are not reviewing their BMD ballot marking devices, which causes generated results to be unauditable due to the untrustworthy audit trail. So this is just a sequence of findings. There's a lot more that goes on from there. But he was, coming away from kind of the first demonstration of the Georgia's new software with some very, very fundamental, real concerns. So much so that he continued on in the lawsuits, which I think are still proceeding even now in Fulton County over this. Now, a very interesting thing happened because I'd written this article, and that's where I found Hursty. It was my first article, my first foray into this. And as part of the article, we reached out to one of the voting companies for comment on November 11th about Hursty's allegations. I'm looking down because I'm reading this. It's been a long time. And the company didn't respond to us. The article got published on the morning of November 12th. We reached out to him the night before. That afternoon, CISA came out and published its statement denying the election results. The next day, we were sent an email from that company that was titled Setting the Record Straight, Facts and Rumors, which fundamentally underneath it all cited the statement that CISA had issued the day before, but was really the statement that they had issued written up for CISA that CISA then issued. So, this is the kind of thing, the more you scratch the surface, the worse things get. And that was my experience going down that rabbit hole, is just nothing but alarming. And the court cases have continued to reflect that.
Well, and the wider point, of course, that the fact that the government was cooperating, not to say colluding, but okay, let's just say it colluding.
Yeah, no, colluding.
With dodgy private vendors who were supplying this equipment. Now, I think a huge disservice was done to us all back in 2020 by the people who just went over the top. Trump won by a landslide. No, he didn't. It was a close election, but the close election makes it even more important to look at these kinds of things. Or the whole thing about, oh, there was a server somewhere in Spain or whatever, and that's where all the votes get. All these absolutely crazy stories. Now, sometimes I think those crazy stories were seeded in order to sort of take away credibility from the real problems, to make everyone look bad, which kind of often happens. You saw it in Russiagate, you saw it in Ukrainegate, you see this over and over. I don't know. People either got too excited, or these stories were seeded, or it was sort of a mixture of those things. But in any case, it was a huge disservice because it made the whole topic toxic, and we weren't able to talk about the substance thing, the things we know, not the things we speculate about, the things we can provably know. And as you said, you wrote a bunch of articles back then. If those had been taken as the basis for further investigation, we'd have been much further along right now. But of course, we never got there because those things were just made instantly toxic. You're not allowed to talk about it. Well, here we are, 3.5, 4 years later, and the guy in charge, not just some employee, the guy in charge of one of these voting machines, okay, not Dominion, just to make that clear, but one of these companies. By the way, Smartmatic says they supply, what is it, the biggest voting region in the US or something, being LA. They pride themselves on that.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if anything dodgy happened there, but
I think it's LA, maybe even only at this point, but yet it's still not small.
Not small, but the guy in charge of that company has just been indicted for corruption. So if we had just been able to spend the past few years digging deeper into those things, we'd be much, much further along now. I'm not even sure whether that's going to happen now, or whether it's just going to be, oh, well, that's all. I hope we, at some point, we get some kind of closure on what exactly happened. Now, my personal view is still that what happened at the 2020 election was mainly determined by these unsolicited mail-in ballots. If you put out 100 million official ballots and just send them out all over the map, you're going to get a huge amount of fraud. That's just automatic. So I don't know in how far these machines had an influence or not, or whatever, but we were never able to investigate because, well, everything was kind of shut off. You weren't allowed to talk about it. Remember on old Twitter, you were banned for even mentioning it.
Well, in some respects, I feel like these machines were used as a bulwark for what was going on in terms of the mail-in ballots. You mentioned the 100 million. I mean, stop and think about that number for a minute in the context of, the adult U.S. population. It's absolutely enormous. And as you say, no matter what anybody says, when you flood the electoral system with that number of ballots, there's going to be fraud. And one of the things that came out of the rulings, Judge Tottenberg, when she's been part of this ongoing multitude of cases in Georgia, and she found that the Dominion machines were unauditable based on the nature of the machines themselves. Now, there was a lot of pushback on that. Voting Works, some other people tried to claim that was otherwise, but it was overwhelmingly rejected. A number of experts came in and demonstrated to the court why that was untrue, and that you could not do a true risk-limiting audit on these machines. And that should have been a big blow. It wasn't, unfortunately. Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, was able to claim that he did all these risk-limiting audits, which is utter nonsense. If you look at the audits themselves, the first one he did, he had Pro V&V, which is a subcontractor to Dominion, was the one that ran that audit. And the only thing that Pro V&V did was they demonstrated that all the Dominion machines were certified to be used by the Secretary of State's office. That was the audit. But you had to dig for that to find that information. The headline in the statement was, we've done a complete audit. So, they were able to go out and pretend that everything was fine. Meanwhile, in many respects, that's running cover for, the 100 million mail-in ballots that are floating out there. So, these machines just shouldn't be part of anything. They should be, like you started us off, with talking about the fact that we should just be on paper ballots, and that is emphatically what we should be on. There's so many questions with these machines, if you read through the court documents, that, let's just take, at a minimum, let's just say, okay, let's take the uncertainty out of it. And it is unfortunate that we got sidetracked into all these other things and weren't able to drill down into this, because there was a lot to be found just within this network alone. Well, before I get into another story, I'll let you jump back in here.
Yeah, I think this point, well, we should all have reached this point by now, including reasonable Democrats if they still exist. The fact that we should not have these machines, even in a perfect world, I would not have these machines. If you had perfect integrity among all the people involved with the machines, even if we assumed that was the case, and that's never going to be the case because you got software engineers and you got people install it, you got, as you say, backdoors, you got so many things that can go wrong. But let's assume that that's the case. I still wouldn't have it simply because of the perception, because most 99.9% of people don't know how these things work, including myself on a granular level. All we know is that it's possible something could go wrong. So why take that risk? And it just creates this very bad perception. So just don't have it. And again, as I said earlier, not only now in 2024, but I mean in 1,000 years, in 5,000 years, like forever. Because like, ask AI a question about anything, and half the time it lies to you. So how can we have any trust? You need to have trust. There needs to be integrity. And you're just not going to achieve that unless it's one person, one vote per one paper ballot within their own handwriting with their own ink. That's the only way it's going to work. And that should just, but that's been the case historically. And some things should just not change. Some things should be just set in stone. And that's one, not many things, but some things. And that's one of them. Just because the process of elections being really core of Western civilization, Western democracy, that's the core of it. So we need to ensure that there's integrity. And on that point, everyone should agree, including Democrats, ultra leftists, like literally everyone should agree that now we have proof, or well, close to proof. We'll have to see how it unfolds in terms of court, or whether these guys are going to plead or whatever, that this company had no integrity. That's the core of it. The apologists will say, oh, it was just a bribe in the Philippines. Well, that means the company had no integrity. If the company has no integrity, it has no business. Even if you think voting machines are a good idea, it has no business being in this business.
The guy that Smartmatic themselves said is the person responsible for the day-to-day operations of the company is the person who was indicted. You cannot separate that and just pretend like, oh, it was just a bribe in the Philippines. No, the person who sort of he's the operator of the company was taking those bribes and was part of that. So no, you can't separate that. And when I was digging into this back in 2020, one thing that became abundantly clear to me was, this whole idea of sort of electoral independence. I mean, it was wildly politicized. And you had, when you've got federal agencies involved in terms of CISA and EAC, well, we've all seen the level of politicization that's gone on with these federal agencies. If anything, I can tell you that it appeared to be even worse at those two small entities, and that they were working far too closely, intertwined. Some officials actually migrating between the federal agencies and the companies. That they were far too entwined. So, just the whole nature of it, absolutely. Everybody should be in favor of paper ballots. And it's, of course, very telling that you have so many Democrats that are not in favor of. I mean, Mark Elias has made a career out of fighting for not having paper ballots and not having voter ID. Again, just the simplistic nature that Democrats and DNC leaders, DNC operatives, that none of them want to have voter ID or paper ballots should tell you a lot about exactly why we should have voter ID and paper ballots.
Even the ones who might be, I'm just trying to build a case where someone might legitimately think it's good to be able to cheat. And this could, these machines and the mail-ins and all this kind of what they called fortification. You could argue, if you were on that side of things, that, well, you need this safeguard, right? What if the next Hitler comes? You need to stop Hitler, right? Everyone agrees. It's 1938 and you're in Germany. You need to, well, then actually that was too late. 1933 was when the last elections were, okay? So it's January 1933 and you got to stop Hitler. Well, You got the machines, right? Well, they didn't, but you know what I mean, right? So I'm just trying to sort of think through how you could kind of morally justify doing basically cheating. And I'm not saying that I mean, maybe some people just want to cheat for the sake of it, but it is possible to think that way. Well, we cannot give these people the means of doing that, because people will justify anything. So again, just you can't have it. And after this whole new incident with Smartmatic, it just should be obvious to just everyone. You can never guarantee. It's like with COVID, and like, oh, these public health officials, they want the best for us, and then it turns out no, actually they were trying to cover up the fact that this thing came out of the lab. You can never know what goes on in another person's head. So the idea of just transferring all this leverage, all this power to some other guy over our elections is just madness, and it's just been proven. And I for the life of me cannot understand how we don't have everyone, literally everyone, except maybe those in an insane asylum, agreeing that, we just have to have paper ballots. That's it.
Yeah, and I mean, the idea about guardrails, I mean, my counter argument is simply that we're the guardrails. And, the whole argument that, well, you could have stopped Hitler in 1933, well, the left is using their disinformation campaigns has painted Trump as Hitler. Therefore, to kind of the Democrat on the street, it's justified to stop Trump, even though we've had 4 years of Trump and he was demonstrably not Hitler. So, it's just another element in the whole disinformation. You label something as disinformation, then you can censor it. Meanwhile, the things that are actually disinformation are not censored. So, it just continues to circle back. We need to get back to paper ballots. And my guess is first of all, that we're going to have more come out of this. But it may not be right away. There wasn't a whole lot of information in the release. I wouldn't be surprised if there's more coming. But regardless, I hope that it re-energizes this whole conversation. I'd love to get to the bottom of 2020, dearly love to. But most importantly, I just don't want to have those companies operating in our system that way, the electoral system. So I hope this is kind of the avenue to really start having an honest conversation about that. So, we'll see.
We'll see indeed. I mean, maybe one last point here is the Fox payment. The Murdochs paid Dominion. Again, Dominion is not Smartmatic, but anyway, they paid them close to $1 billion for things that Tucker Carlson allegedly said on his show. Again, huge disservice to the point you just made about, let's have this conversation, because it shut off the conversation. There was never a court case. There was never a discovery. Well, only discovery as to Tucker Carlson's text messages, but we never went further. We never went further in terms of analyzing these machines, looking at the people there, and so on and so forth. Now, I don't know if there would have been something there, but obviously, as we just saw with Smartmatic, if you look, you find, and that never happened. So I completely agree with you. I hope this is going to trigger a process where we can go back and look at these things again.
Yeah, just one final item I'd like to throw out, sorry, and that is simply that it's not just these entities. It extends up into CISA and EAC, the Election Authority Commission, I think it is. It extends into those agencies. So those federal agencies, which had this patina of we're here to safeguard elections, they need to be looked at and restructured as well. Everything that I found there was really alarming. So maybe we can close with that.